Hey to all metal maniacs, welcome back to the Iron Horde channel for another weekend video. Another episode filled with great bands and great records, albums which have been so pivotal for me personally and to a certain extent even for the whole heavy metal scene. As you know, I do not generally include the bigger bands, and this video will be no exception. I prefer for the listeners and viewers here to discover newer bands, lesser known bands that have the same quality rather than giving you bands which probably the majority already know. So off we go with some of my favorite records from the 2010s. Let's go! Before jumping to the albums, let me introduce you the aim of this channel. It is mainly to review albums and festivals, suggest bands, delve in the cultural aspect of heavy metal in general and more. So if you're interested in this content, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing, liking, clicking the bell, sharing our videos on social media as well. That would really help us out. And back again for the subject at hand. For those who watched last week's video with regards to my favorite albums released in the first 10 years of this century, I reiterated on a number of occasions that those years had completely forged my approach to heavy metal, made me realize that heavy metal wasn't just music but practically a way of life, a religion basically, with its rituals and traditions that need to be respected and upheld. Having said that, the 2010s, or the 10s, I feel quite strange actually to say that, the 10s. Doesn't feel as strange as saying the 80s or the 90s actually, but I think because I have used to saying 80s and 90s much more. Anyways, the 10s for me served to reinforce my creed and the cultivation of that network of friends throughout the online communication, attending festivals abroad, the organization of even the Malta Doom Metal Festival. I mean, all these kind of things built up my network within this underground scene of heavy metal. So this particular decade and the albums I will be presenting here will collectively show my allegiance to that underground participation and the almost morbid fascination with records who initially might be obscure to most, but which in some cases they evolved to become pretty successful and known. So without any further explanations, in chronological order, from earliest to the latest, here goes my favorite records from the 2010s. The first one from 2011 is L'Impero delle Ombre with the album I Compagni de Bal, released with Black Widow Records. If you have been following my videos, you already know how much I love Italian Doom and how much I love this band as one of those few who kept the spirit of that Italian Doom metal sound alive. This is their second release, the first one released in 2004, an album I had included in the Italian Doom Metal Essential Albums video. I even included their third album released last year in the top 2020 albums video as well. This second record for me was a confirmation of the greatness of this band. You could imagine how satisfied I was whilst discovering these new tracks at the time, that there was a band that was continuing on the tradition of other Italian bands that came a number of years before them. Mind you, Impero delle Ombre, which in English translates to Empire of Shadows, are not actually a copy of any of those bands, but rather they captured the spirit and made it their own. something they refer to as symmetry rock. Obviously the basic influence is still Black Sabbath, check out the Snowblind cover on here as well, but mixed to a more obscure and mystical approach. What I also love about this band is that they sing in Italian. It feels so much more authentic to me. So remember the name, if you are somewhat into doom metal, L'Impero delle Ombre is your next favorite band. And with regards to favorites, my preferred track on here is the slower, almost sorrowful Ballata per Liliana. That mid-section emotional guitar solo is just so beautiful. Remaining in 2011, heading north to the UK, and I bring you Human Remains by the band Hell, released with Nuclear Blast Records. And this is the one. As you know, I'm a big new wave of British heavy metal fan, and throughout the years I have come across a demo by a band named Race Against Time. Very particular sounding tracks, not the usual new wave of heavy metal stuff like Maiden, Saxon, etc. More in the vein of Witchfind. I became hooked on this demo big time. I played it over and over again. After the demise of that band, Dave Halliday, the mind behind the band, set up Hell and recruited 3 guys who at the time played with another new wave of British heavy metal band by the name of Parallax. Still, Hell were only capable of releasing a few demos with little success, and unfortunately in 1987 Dave Halliday committed suicide. Fast forward to 2008 and Andy Sneap, ex-guitarist from the band, thrash band Sabbath, who used to be a student a guitar student of Dave Halliday, decided to contact the band members from Hell in order to revive the band and start playing live once more. They actually re-recorded some of these tracks which were basically lost in the abyss of the new wave of British heavy metal underworld, and these tracks ended up being on this full-length record. So this is a mix of Hell tracks and some Race Against Time tracks. And this new chapter of this band, along with the inclusion of Dave Bauer on vocals, brother of guitarist Kev Bauer, who replaced obviously Dave Halliday, and it was really a great choice in choosing him because there are certain similarities in the voice and he has that theatrical approach as well. So as I said, this led to the release of Human Remains, which is for me a masterful and great record. Really captured the spirit of the demos, as I said, in a theatrical way, similar in certain occasions to Merciful Fate and the way they project their music. Everything feels so contemporary, yet one can still feel that new wave of British heavy metal vibe in these tracks. There is a sense of darkness throughout as well. For example, I just love the intro to Plague and Fire, a track about the 17th century London plague, with the wailing in the background and the body collectors intimating the villagers to bring out their dead. For those who had prior knowledge of these tracks, this release was like bringing justice to such an unknown gem and some recognition to a great artist such as Dave Halliday. One of those bands that we had the honor to host at the Malta Doom Fest and to see Andy Sneap on stage, and a few months later joining Judas Priest. It was kind of a surreal feeling. Favorite track on here would be Save Us from Those Who Would Save Us. Moving on to 2012, heading to Germany now, and I bring you Inside Metropolis by the band Ketzer, released by Iron Bonehead Records. This is the album right here. With regards to the style here, we are veering towards that black thrash or blackened thrash sound if you prefer, which is quite famous in Germany and the northern countries more or less. At least there is a substantial amount of bands adopting the same approach like this band in the last decade or so. But getting back to this record, basically what we have here is a wave of tremolo guitar riffing beefed up by equally potent rhythmic section and violent vocal screams, which at certain points even offer some melodic parts as well. This is the sophomore release from Ketzer, with the debut being Satan's Boundaries Unchanged, which was a more in-your-face approach compared to this one. On Inside Metropolis there is a certain maturity. The band are able to make more variations to the music without losing that killer and raw edge. Think kind of Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning as comparison with regards to progression rather than the sound, as the Metallica albums are outright thrash metal albums, but you basically get an idea the comparison between this album and the prior album. The inclusion of atmospheric passages throughout the album also give it a sinister and evil imprint, which I really love in this type of music. The listener has to somewhat feel the presence of a malignant kind of presence being transmitted through these sounds. Unfortunately, the subsequent albums they released lacked all of this, and they evolved into something which doesn't really attract my attention anymore. So I will keep on coming back to these first two records, and I actually never get tired of listening to this music. If I had to choose a favorite track, a task which is not that easy here, I would go for Fever's Tide. Onwards to 2013, and it is the time of Satan with the album Life Sentence, which is this one over here, released with Listenable Records. If the release from Hell was making justice to an obscure new wave of British heavy metal band, Life Sentence brought us back a legendary band from the same movement, and they brought it back with a vengeance. This is one of the best comeback records ever made, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, how the hell do you capture the sound of an album you have released 26 years prior? And this band really shows us how. It is incredible how they released a record that sounds like it was recorded and released actually in the 80s. I remember listening to one of the tracks before the actual release of this record at the time, and I was totally floored. I told myself, if this record is of the same quality as this track, it will take something for me to put this record down and start listening to another record. And it definitely was on the same level, and I played this one non-stop for months on my home setup, in my car, at events. I actually played one of these tracks in an activity related to my day job, which has nothing to do with heavy metal, but I got the occasion and I threw a track from this album over there as well. That's how much I was into this record. I just love the guitar duo of Russ Tippins and Steve Ramsey, the quality of the riffs and the guitar solos. Both of them complement each other so well. Definitely the Tipton Downing of the new wave of British heavy metal. The unique vocals of Brian Ross kind of bring everything together and give that specific identity to this record. The music, the execution, the production, the artwork, everything is perfect on this record. Anyone, and I mean anyone who is into heavy metal, needs to have this record and listen to it. It is, for me, an essential album. Favorite track would be Incantations. And 2003 brought us some great doom metal, not from Italy this time, but all the way from Chile. I bring you the album To Reap Heavens Apart by Procession, released by High Roller Records. Actually, this record on here is split 50-50 between Chile and Sweden, but for me, Procession are and will remain always a South American band. Anyways, this is a great epic doom metal record, like a mix of Candlemas and Doomsword, because the epic feel here is much more of a battle-like epicness rather than the grandiose feeling which comes out of bands like Solitude Aeternus or Forsaken, for example. It is a record which contains faster parts like on the title track and Conjurer, slower and more introspective parts like on Death Minstrel and Far From Light, There is a sense of dreadfulness and loss of hope, but transmitted through a very powerful and monolithic medium. It is an album kind of filled with pride even in the face of adversity. This is not something common that I can say about a lot of records, but this one in particular gives me that kind of feeling. One will find some great guitar solos on here as well, which intertwine in a beautiful way with the melody and the riffs of the tracks. It is just a brilliant piece of music which I will never get tired of listening to. Favorite track would be Death and Judgment. Staying in 2013 and moving back to Europa now, and for referring to Europe in its Latin format, maybe some of you will understand what is the band that comes next. If you want another hint, what about narrowing their location down to Bavaria, Germany? Still no idea? Okay, I'm referring to Atlantean Codex and their album The White Goddess, released with Van Records. Quite a unique sounding band, but its influences are quite evident. Let me explain. I mean, think about a mix between Manowar, Candlemas and Bathory. Yes, it is epic metal with a doomier side, quite similar to Doomsword again, but the Italians feel more barbaric in their approach, whilst Atlantean Codex music feels much more like a hymn or a triumphant march. It is impressive to think the differences between bands who are playing music influenced by the same artists, yet they seem so different at times. This is the best, I think, explanation of bands who do their own thing without going overboard with experimentation, which leads to losing kind of the soul and true essence of heavy metal. Music evolves, but it should evolve in unison with the music that came before it, not veer off completely in a different world and still want it to be associated with heavy metal. But anyways, rant off, that was just a small clarification. Atlantean Codex are another band we had the pleasure to host at the Malta Doom Metal Fest, and it is something that had to be done since they actually mention a famous Maltese landmark in one of the tracks on this record. More precisely, the megalithic temple of Hajar-Im in the track Sol Invictus. The beauty of this record is that it flows so well, the interludes between the tracks are so brilliant, and they are kind of the bridge which leads you to the next number. Everything is so well thought out, the lyrics are another highlight, plenty to occupy your time and process. On here you'll probably discover something new with every listen. At least that's what happened to me with this record. And that really fills me with satisfaction, because I know every time I listen to this, something new will crop up. Favorite track on this album is not an easy one to choose, but I go for Enthroned in Clouds and Fire. Moving on to 2014 and heading to the United States with one of the most underrated doom metal bands. A band mixing slow music with horror themes. I bring you the album Headless Eyes by Blood Farmers, released with Resurrection Productions. And over here I have one of the test press copies of this record. Only 35 head number copies were made of this on black vinyl. This is a spray painted stencil cover, hand stamped center labels as well, stickers and flyers, as you can see from here, numbered by guitarist Dave Salkin. This is copy number 24 out of 35 as well. All in all, this is a very special band for me, which I had the opportunity to see live at the Hammer of Doom Fest in 2011. Never in a million years did I think that it would happen, as for a number of years this band situation was practically unknown and there wasn't much info coming from them to understand exactly if they were continuing with the music or not, but imagine my elation when I discovered a new album was on the way. In reality, I knew about the band writing new material quite ahead of the rest, as after their 2011 performance I remained in contact with Dave Zalkin, and we used to have long chats online, and he even sent me some samples of the tracks and some audio samples of different amps he was testing before going in for the recording of this album. So yes, listening to this final product was an amazing experience for me, and it didn't disappoint at all. That eerie atmosphere mixed with those slow and heavy riffs creates such a unique experience, all wrapped up in kind of a psychedelic layer. There are also 2 instrumentals on here, and also Dave has cover named The Road Leads to Nowhere, which originally appeared in the 1972 horror movie The Last House on the Left. If horror and doom metal is your thing, be sure to make this record your own, get it in any way possible, because you will be pleased to have this record in your collection. Favorite track on here would be Headless Eyes. Back to Germany, and I bring you the album Oath of an Iron Ritual by the band Disaster, released with Metal Blade Records. And yet another band that played at the MDM with their blend of black and thrash metal, actually one of those stalwart bands within this genre who are actually kind of underrated in a certain way, having released 9 studio records in their 30+ year career, and having withstood all the ups and downs of such an underground style of heavy metal, yet they are still there, never compromising on their brutality and savagery. And this record is another statement of their intent, actually one of the best they have ever released, although this is not a simple task to make, as most of their records are totally above average. Galloping riffs, furious outbursts, dynamic tempo changes, demonic and vigorous vocals accompanied with an appropriate production, and the result is a wave of, as I said, brutality which pulverizes everything in its way. Clearly influenced by the likes of Venom and Teutonic giants like Sodom and Destruction, Disaster carry the flag of black and thrash metal in the most emphatic form. If bands like Destroyer 666 or Anwar, Niflheim are what you are looking forward to, then Disaster should be a mainstay in your playlists. On here I'm going for 2 tracks as my favorite, because I can't really choose between them, and so here it goes. The tracks are The Cleric's Arcanum and Damnatio ad Bestias. Moving on to 2017, back to the States, and since I wanted to add an outright thrash metal band who better represents this subgenre for this particular decade than Power Trip, and their sophomore record Nightmare Logic, which should be somewhere over here. This is the one. I have got to know this band pretty early on in their career, both for the fact that Southern Lord Records, which is their label, is strongly associated with doom metal acts, so this led me to discover this band more easily in a certain way, and because of the fact that the guitarist Blake Ibanez plays in another band I follow and love, which is Eternal Champion. And I loved what I was hearing from at the time from them. Maybe at times they were a bit into crossover and hardcore, which isn't really something I search for, but the thrash metal elements were definitely the most visible and most prominent in their music. Their debut, Manifest Decimation, was definitely more savage in its approach, whilst this one is a bit more controlled and the tracks feel more defined. It generally depends on my mood which one I opt for, but they are definitely defining albums of contemporary thrash metal. And believe me, it is not often I get excited with a thrash metal album from recent years. But this one is intense, it's violent, the drums alternate between a steady mid-paced framework to a high-speed pummeling in a split second. The riffs are catchy and you'll find yourself headbanging in no time. The vocals are rough and savage, and The ability in composing tracks that keep your utmost attention is second to none. Unfortunately, in August of last year, the frontman Riley Gale suffered a fentanyl overdose and passed away at the very young age of 34. A sad ending to a band that had the possibility of reaching a very high status, generally reserved for those 70s, 80s bands which are still going strong today. Hopefully the band can continue and get an equally good replacement and keep on churning out great thrash metal music. If I had to choose a favorite track on this record, that would be Firing Squad. Staying in the US and moving on to 2018 and another band that carries on the torch of 80s US power metal with the utmost pride. I'm referring to the band Visigoth and their sophomore album Conqueror's Oath, released with Metal Blade Records. For those fantasy and mythology fanatics, those that imagine themselves as some kind of knight or medieval mercenary, those that have the Witcher's tales at heart, then with Visigoth you'll feel right at home. This is the kind of music you'll find yourself singing along, fists up in the air, like there's no tomorrow. An album that flows so easily because each track delivers different moods. It actually feels somewhat like a story being narrated to you, although this one ain't some kind of concept album either, so every track has its own story. Influenced by the likes of Manila Road, Omen, Broca's Helm, Manowar, Medieval Steel, Visigoth embarks on a journey to bring back those grandiose adventures which transmit hope and the sense that whatever the situation, in the end good always defeats evil. It is easy to fall into excessive cheesiness on this style of heavy metal, but I believe Visigoth have the ability to avoid such a trap and forge ahead with intent, leaving no prisoners behind. Wielding their brand of poser slashing sword, they bring forth a record which remains fresh with every listen. In times when you feel like listening to something uplifting and energetic, Visigoth is the answer. Again, another album which has the potential to be liked by the vast majority of heavy metal listeners, as it has melody, powerful vocals and a great execution. Favorite track on here, it's not that difficult for me, again not because the other tracks are not so good, but the track Traitor's Gate is one of the best tracks for me of the whole decade. And there goes another 10 records that for me defined the decade, starting from 2010. A mix of epic, doom, heavy and black thrash styles which really define my overall tastes within heavy metal. These are records that I still listen to very frequently, and this will definitely not change in the years to come, as to my ears these are some of the best contemporary records made, and I have already given them kind of a classic status stamp. I hope you get the same ecstatic feeling I get from these albums, and for those who will be embarking on the journey to discovering and getting to know these records, enjoy your ride. I'm sure that a few of these will remain in heavy rotation regardless of which format you use to listen to your music. Needless to say, always support the artists and never download illegally. Of course, this takes money to do, so it's imperative you support the artists financially and also with your support in their live gigs. Remember to write down in the comments your preferred albums and any comments you have on the records I have chosen. As usual, I'll be looking forward to that, to reading your opinions and to see which albums you prefer from this decade. Anyways, if you like this content, would be appreciated if you could subscribe, click the bell, like the video and share it on social media. Before closing off, as usual, stay safe and metal on. Cheers!